In the spring of 2007, 16-year-old Lily Kim sat in her school's auditorium watching the annual talent show. She clapped when the lights came up on her friend Joy Summers, who was dressed in a white tutu. Lily turned to Joy's mom, Frances, who was sitting beside her and beaming with pride. Joy was a classically trained dancer. She'd been performing her entire life, and Lily had almost always been in the audience, cheering on her best friend. She loved watching Joy perform, and she knew that Joy loved being on stage. When the music started, it was like Joy came to life. Lily sat on the edge of her chair, watching Joy turn pirouette after pirouette, then leap into a graceful midair split. The whole audience broke into applause, even though the music was still playing. Lily watched excitedly as her friend moved towards the lip of the stage, preparing for her biggest move of the whole performance. But right as Joy was about to rise up on the tips of her toes to begin this maneuver, she seemed to just freeze. It was like Joy was suddenly suspended, like time had stopped on stage. Lily leaned forward, searching her friend's face for some sign of what was going on. But Joy just stood there, flat-footed, looking at the floor like she couldn't remember how she got on stage in the first place. Lily and Joy's mom exchanged worried glances. Over the past few years, Joy had frozen up like this a few other times. She just suddenly stopped whatever she was doing and stared off blankly into space. But it had never happened while she was performing on stage. Lily felt so bad she was about to jump out of her seat and run to her friend, but before she could, Joy's mother had already gotten up and begun moving down the row of seats towards the center aisle. Lily started to hear the murmurs filling the auditorium over Joy's music, which was still playing. Some people clearly seemed worried, like something might be wrong, but others were obviously mocking the ballerina who couldn't seem to remember her dance. And their mean comments made Lily's blood boil. Lily watched helplessly as Joy's mother walked up the aisle to the edge of the stage where Joy still stood, motionless. Frances began tapping Joy's foot until Joy finally looked down at her and seemed to snap out of whatever had made her freeze. When she did, a mixture of applause and laughter filled the auditorium as Frances pointed her daughter toward the side curtains, and Joy quickly hurried off stage. A few days later, Lily sat next to Joy in history class, taking notes as their teacher peppered the students with questions. Lily was a bit nervous. Normally, she and Joy studied history together, and Lily could rely on her friend to figure out the more challenging parts of the lesson. But after what had happened at the talent show, Joy had not been in the mood to get together. And now it seemed like Joy wasn't paying any attention at all. Normally, she would closely follow along and raise her hand to answer questions. But now, she was just sitting there, staring blankly, like she was totally zoned out. And then when the teacher actually called on Joy to read a passage from the textbook, Joy just sat there saying nothing. Lily could see her friend was having another freezing spell, and so quickly she reached over and tapped Joy on the shoulder, trying to shake her out of it the same way Joy's mom had done at the talent show. And after a few seconds, it worked. Joy shook her head like she was just getting startled out of her sleep and couldn't remember where she was. Lily quietly showed Joy the spot in the textbook where they were. Joy nodded and began reading out loud. Except Joy's speech was slow, and she stumbled over easy words and stuttered. But Joy was an honors student, and she had never had trouble reading aloud before. Lily gave Joy a sidelong glance. Something was clearly wrong here. But when Joy didn't seem to react to Lily's stare, Lily just looked up at the teacher as if to say, "Please, call on somebody else." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the teacher asked Joy if maybe she wanted to stop and step out of the room for a minute and get some air. Joy nodded, and as she got up, the teacher called on Lily to start reading. Lily picked up where Joy had left off, and as she did, out of the corner of her eye, she watched her dazed-looking friend leave the classroom. Joy didn't return for the last 15 minutes of class. So when class ended, Lily packed up Joy's belongings and went to go find her. Lily left the classroom and walked down the locker-lined hallway, but didn't see Joy anywhere. But then, up ahead, she saw two girls exiting the bathroom, snickering at something they had just seen. Lily picked up her pace and at the same time felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew these girls could be laughing about Joy. Lily opened up the bathroom door, and sure enough, there was Joy. She was standing at the paper towel dispenser with a massive wad of paper towels bunched in her hand, and more paper littered the floor all around her feet. Joy had been methodically ripping paper towel after paper towel out of the dispenser and just throwing them on the ground like she had no idea what she was doing. But what really scared Lily was actually Joy's expression as she did this. She was completely blank-faced. She was just staring at the wall and pulling out paper towels over and over again, seemingly unaware that anybody else was in the bathroom. Lily didn't know what to do. It was like her friend was possessed or something. She walked over and tapped Joy on the shoulder like she'd done in class, but this time, Joy didn't seem to even notice. It was chilling. Whatever was going on with Joy, Lily knew it was more than just zoning out. A couple seconds later, Joy did snap out of it, and as soon as she did, she couldn't remember any of it. It was like her memory had gone completely blank. A few weeks later, near the end of the school year, Joy's mother, Frances, was upstairs changing into her running clothes when she heard the front door open. Joy was home from school. Frances called out hello, but in return, she heard a loud, heavy sob. It startled Frances. She ran downstairs to find Joy in the kitchen, sitting at the table and crying into her hands. Joy began unloading to her mother. School used to be easy and fun for her, but now it was miserable. She'd failed another exam, and she was in danger of flunking some of her classes. Plus, other students were starting to make fun of her for these weird zoning out spells she was having. By the time Joy had ran out of tears and breath, all Frances could do was hug her daughter. She was shocked. She didn't realize that Joy had been zoning out so much at school, or that she was struggling in school. Frances almost felt mad at herself for not seeing how bad things had gotten. And so she decided she would make an appointment with the school and talk to some of Joy's teachers before summer vacation started. She needed a clearer picture of what was going on. The following week, Frances sat at a small conference table at Joy's school. A few of Joy's teachers were sitting there too, along with the school psychologist. Frances recognized a few of the people from parent-teacher conferences, where they had all told her that Joy was a pleasure to have in class. And deep down, Frances hoped they'd just say the same thing now. She wanted them to assure her that Joy was doing fine, that her recent behavior was just normal teenage mood swings. But that didn't happen. Joy's AP biology teacher told Frances that Joy was struggling, academically and socially, and her behavior was alarming to the staff, who knew Joy as a bright, engaging student. She wasn't keeping up with her work and never participated in class anymore. She seemed overwhelmed a lot of the time. It was almost like she was shutting down. The other teachers around the table just nodded their heads solemnly. Joy's history teacher eventually chimed in, saying that Joy was actually struggling just to read out loud, and that it was really alarming to hear an honors student struggle to sound out common two-syllable words. Frances was so shocked by what Joy's teachers were telling her that she struggled to say anything in response. That's when the psychologist suggested that maybe Joy's struggles were not really academic. Maybe they were more psychological, and Joy would benefit from therapy. However, Frances was skeptical. She didn't think that counseling would necessarily fix Joy's problem. Whatever was happening to her daughter appeared to be more of a physical issue than a psychological one. By the time Frances left the meeting at the school, she decided to take Joy to see a doctor who could help figure out what was going on. Several months later, in the fall of 2007, Frances sat beside her daughter in their dining room having dinner. For dessert, they enjoyed some leftover cake from Joy's birthday the week before. It had been a quiet affair. Last year, for her Sweet 16, Joy threw a big party with all her friends. But this year, they had just celebrated with one friend, Lily, who'd been the only friend to stick by Joy since her freezing episodes had started last spring. After Frances had had that meeting with Joy's teachers, she had taken her daughter to see a doctor. Specifically, she had taken her to a psychoneurologist, which is a doctor who specializes in the relationship between the physical state of the brain and how it affects human behavior. And that doctor, to start with, had given Joy a standard test to measure intellectual ability. And the results were surprising. Although Joy was having issues with memory and with language while she was in school, the test results showed only minimal impairment in those categories. So the mother and daughter had gone home without any real answers. But the psychoneurologist reassured them that it did not seem like Joy was dealing with anything really dangerous, such as brain cancer. However, over the course of that summer, Joy's behavior had grown even stranger. Her staring spells had gotten longer, and they were happening more frequently, and she developed an even more disruptive behavior: uncontrollable laughter. Joy would just start laughing out loud for no reason, and she would have no idea what triggered it. And then one evening, after Frances came home from a workout class, she found Joy in the kitchen, and she just looked different. It took Frances a moment to realize why. The right side of her daughter's face was drooping, like she'd lost all muscle control on that side of her face. Frances knew that a drooping face is a telltale sign of a stroke, and so immediately she brought Joy to the hospital, but a stroke was ruled out. And in fact, other than her daughter's droopy face, she really had nothing else wrong with her. And so between her daughter's concerning behavior, downward spiraling self-esteem, and social struggles, Frances had decided to pull Joy out of school before the fall term started. Now, Frances knew she would have to homeschool Joy now that she was out of school, and so she anticipated teaching Joy some of her advanced courses. But Joy's intellectual struggles had grown so severe that she could barely even handle a remedial course load. And so the bright, vivacious girl with a bright future who'd taken the dance stage just a few months earlier was nowhere to be seen. And now, sitting at the dinner table, it made Frances unbelievably sad to watch her daughter push her leftover birthday cake around her plate with the right side of her face completely slack. It always looked like she was frowning now, which Frances knew mirrored the way Joy very likely felt. But just then, Joy suddenly dropped her fork and sat upright. She whipped around and scanned the room like she was expecting to see someone. Before Frances could ask what was wrong, Joy started talking. But not to her. Joy wasn't even looking in her mother's direction. Instead, Joy was basically staring at the wall, having some sort of heated discussion with some imaginary person in the corner who apparently was making fun of her. Frances didn't know if she was witnessing a mental breakdown or some kind of a seizure, but she knew Joy's problems were now too extreme for her to manage. Her daughter was in urgent need of help, and so Frances raced to call an ambulance. After the ambulance brought Joy to the hospital, the next few weeks passed by in a blur. Upon arriving, Joy was admitted to the hospital for testing to figure out what was causing her delusions. It took a few days, but Joy's doctors finally diagnosed her with schizophrenia, a serious mental health condition that can cause hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking and behavior. From a medical perspective, it actually made sense to Joy's mom. The doctors explained that schizophrenia often manifests around this time in people's lives, as older teenagers or young adults. But still, the diagnosis crushed Frances and caused Joy to burst into tears. Schizophrenia is a chronic, debilitating disorder, and Frances knew that Joy would be managing it for the rest of her life. Following Joy's schizophrenia diagnosis, her doctors transferred her to the psych ward and put her on antipsychotic drugs to help reduce her hallucinations. However, although they tried several different medications, none of them worked. Joy still zoned out for minutes at a time and hallucinated faces right there in the hospital room. She still burst out laughing at random moments, and one side of Joy's face was still drooping, which didn't even seem like a problem that would come from schizophrenia. And so the doctors ordered extensive blood work to try to rule out the possibility that maybe her hallucinations were being caused by something else, like an infectious disease, such as Lyme disease. But all of Joy's blood work came back normal. Next, doctors explored the possibility that there was something going on in Joy's brain, in addition to schizophrenia. So a neurologist ordered an electroencephalogram, or EEG for short, which is a test that detects conditions like epilepsy and brain tumors by measuring the electrical activity in the brain. By this point, after several weeks of being in the hospital, Frances really didn't know what to think. Did her daughter have schizophrenia, which was bad enough? Or was it possible Joy had something even worse? Frances was just so anxious about her daughter. But the EEG didn't provide any answers either. When the doctor came back with the results, they were completely normal. Frances told the doctor that she was beyond confused. Based on the battery of tests they'd run on her daughter over the past few weeks, her daughter was physically fine. Her brain activity was normal. And so Frances was beginning to doubt that Joy even had schizophrenia, especially since none of the antipsychotic drugs had made any difference. It just sort of felt like there had been weeks of hospitalization here, and nobody has a clue what's going on, and Joy's condition was completely unchanged. So what was the plan here? The doctor nodded sympathetically to Frances, but then told Frances that the plan was they were going to commit Joy to the hospital indefinitely until they could figure out what was actually going on. Instinctively, Frances stepped in front of her daughter, It was like something had snapped inside of Frances. There was just no way she was going to let her daughter just languish here indefinitely. And so she told the doctor no, and then turned to Joy, who looked terrified, and she assured her daughter that nobody was keeping her in a psych ward against her will. The doctor's face was stern as she asked Frances to reconsider, but Frances put her foot down. If they didn't have answers by the end of this week, she was taking Joy back home. About 6 months later, in May of 2008, Frances finished setting the table for dinner. Joy was already seated, staring at the dining room wall. Frances fixed Joy a plate of food and slid it over to her daughter, knowing that Joy very likely wouldn't even eat a single bite. Joy was in one of her freezing spells that seemed to go on forever these days. Over the last 6 months that Joy had been home from the hospital, her condition had not improved. But Joy was lucky to be home at all. A week after Frances had rejected that doctor's advice, she'd found out that the doctor was planning to take Joy's case to probate court to try to force Joy to remain in the psych ward. Frances had to bring a lawyer to the hospital to get the doctor to back down. The entire incident still made Frances sick to think about. And Frances was especially angry because the hospital doctors never even agreed on what was actually wrong with Joy. Her neurologist believed it was a psychiatric issue, even though the schizophrenia medication hadn't helped. And the psychiatrist thought her problem was neurological, even though there didn't seem to be any physical issues with her brain. It broke Frances's heart to see her daughter like this. Joy had once had such a bright future, and now she was listless and often hopeless. Sometimes her old friend Lily would come over and the girls would watch a movie together, but Lily always left the house looking very sad. Frances knew her daughter needed more medical help, but she really didn't know where to turn. A few weeks earlier, she'd taken Joy to a different medical center where neurologists had performed more tests, including extensive testing for epilepsy. They thought Joy's freezing spells might actually be seizures. But Joy didn't have any freezing spells while they were at the medical center, so the doctors weren't able to monitor and diagnose them. They did take images of her brain with an MRI machine, but it came back normal. It had been another disappointing trip. And so now, Frances felt like they were back to the drawing board. She took a bite of dinner and watched her daughter, who seemed off in her own world. Frances was desperate to understand what was going on with Joy, but an answer seemed further off than ever. More than a year later, in August of 2009, Dr. Kian Farsi sat in his examination room across from Frances and also Joy, who was now 19 years old. Dr. Farsi was a neurologist at a hospital in New York City, and he specialized in tricky diseases that other doctors couldn't figure out. And he had to admit, whatever was going on with Joy definitely fit the bill. As Dr. Farsi talked to Frances about her daughter's baffling condition, he kept glancing up at Joy's face. It was drooping on one side, a symptom that had started after her freezing spells had begun. And while the freezing spells had sort of become the thing Joy and her mother most focused on when talking about her symptoms, to Dr. Farsi, the symptom that stood out the most and likely was the most consequential was actually the drooping face. And so Dr. Farsi asked Frances and Joy if anybody else in their family suffered from schizophrenia or another mental illness. And Frances said no, which confirmed Dr. Farsi's suspicion. He told Frances and Joy that Joy's quick deterioration was uncommon for patients with schizophrenia. Also, facial drooping is uncommon in schizophrenics. To him, facial drooping was evidence that Joy's problems were physical, not a sign of mental illness. Frances frowned and shook her head. She told Dr. Farsi that Joy had already been given an MRI and an EEG, and neither showed that there was anything wrong with her brain physically. The doctor knew this, but told Frances he had a theory. He thought that Joy may have suffered neurological damage that causes a particular kind of inflammation in her brain. EEGs and MRIs would not necessarily pick up on this kind of inflammation, and so he wanted to run some tests on a bit of Joy's brain tissue. To do this, he would need to perform a surgical procedure known as a biopsy to collect a tissue sample from Joy's brain. Frances winced at the idea of somebody removing a bit of her daughter's brain, and she told the doctor that she was very reluctant to subject her daughter to more procedures. But if he really thought this biopsy could lead to answers, she was willing to trust him. A few weeks later, the results of Joy's brain biopsy came back, and finally, Frances and her daughter had some answers. Dr. Farsi was relieved to see that his hunch had been right, though the diagnosis was still frightening. The lab had tested Joy's brain tissue for numerous rare autoimmune diseases, and the results had come back positive for one that was extremely rare, even by Dr. Farsi's standards. Joy had an extremely rare autoimmune disease called GAD autoantibody syndrome, a condition where antibodies that usually protect the brain begin attacking it instead. Specifically, antibodies in Joy's brain were attacking a crucial brain chemical that allows brain cells to talk to each other. As a result, Joy's brain didn't have enough of this chemical, called GAD enzymes, and her thoughts were becoming less and less organized. This is why Joy experienced seizures, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. While other doctors assumed these were the symptoms of schizophrenia, Dr. Farsi had seen the whole picture and realized that the deeper problem was the chemistry inside of Joy's brain. It was a remarkably observant diagnosis. Joy's previous doctors probably did not think to even test her for GAD autoantibody syndrome because Joy was a very special case. She was the first documented patient to have the disease present as a mental illness. Dr. Farsi told Francis that he wondered if there were more patients like Joy out there who were diagnosed with conditions such as schizophrenia, but were actually suffering from GAD autoantibody syndrome. But for the moment, Joy was the first. After Dr. Farsi cracked Joy's case, he found at least 5 other cases that were similar to hers. The medical community still doesn't know what causes GAD autoantibody syndrome, but Joy's biopsy revealed that her brain had been under attack for years. Many of the nerve cells in her brain had been damaged. Unfortunately, the damage to those nerve cells was irreversible. However, Dr. Farsi was able to put Joy on medicine to bring down the inflammation in her brain. He also had her undergo a procedure in which he replaced her plasma with saline to clear her blood of harmful antibodies. And after these measures were in place, Joy did begin to improve. She became more communicative and experienced fewer hallucinations. While she'll never regain the cognitive function she lost, Dr. Farsi's treatment plan has kept her from further decline and saved her from what he called a death sentence while still alive. For several years following Dr. Farsi's treatment, we know that Joy lived with her mother and worked on regaining a sense of normalcy. However, we don't know if she ever finished high school or was able to ever live independently. On February 12, 1999, 42 Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend Silvina Peloso, who was 16 years old, boarded a plane in Eureka, California. After a quick 1-hour-long flight, they landed in San Francisco and then got their bags from baggage claim and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. After Carol signed some rental agreement paperwork with the person at the front desk, they were given car keys, and then the 3 women walked out of the airport into the parking lot where they saw their car. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After the women had put their luggage in the trunk, they all climbed inside, and then Carol began driving east towards the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Julie was competing in a cheerleading competition the following day at that university, and Julie was considering going to this school after she graduated high school, and so this cheerleading competition was a great excuse for her and her mom to check out the campus, and since Silvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, she just tagged along for the trip. After an 1.5-hour long drive, the trio arrived in Stockton, California, and they checked into a hotel, and then the next day, which was the 13th, Julie competed in this cheerleading competition, and then afterwards, her mom, and Silvina spent the rest of the day checking out the campus and the surrounding town. Early the next morning, which was the 14th, the women checked out of their hotel and then drove 3 hours southeast to the sprawling motel complex called Cedar Lodge that was located just outside of Yosemite National Park's western entrance. Their plan was to spend a couple of days sightseeing inside of Yosemite before heading back to the San Francisco airport, where they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jens, and then the 4 of them would continue their journey and fly to Arizona, where they would explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka, California. So midday on the 14th, these 3 women arrive at the Cedar Lodge, and the lot would have been nearly empty because it was the winter time and not that many people were visiting the park at that time. So they pull into the lot, they parked their car, they go into the front desk where they checked in and they got their keys, and then they left the office and walked along the row of first floor rooms all the way to the very corner of the building to room 509, which was their room. Carol used her key, she opened the door, they went inside and dropped their luggage, and then they decided that they were just too tired to actually go in the park and go sightseeing that day. So instead, they kind of had a low-key afternoon and evening, mostly in their hotel room. The next morning, which was the 15th, the women got up early, they hopped in their red rental car, and they drove to the western entrance of Yosemite. They went inside, they parked their car, and they have this wonderful day looking at these astonishing cliff sides and snow-covered mountains and these huge sequoia trees and these beautiful meadows that stretched out in front of them. And then towards the end of the day, Julie and Sylvina actually went ice skating on a frozen pond. So it was just this totally magical day at the park. And then finally, as the sun was starting to go down, the trio finally left the park, got in their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. There, they ate dinner at the lodge's 1950s style diner. They ate hamburgers, and then afterwards, they swung by the front desk and rented some VHS movie tapes that they brought back to their room. Once they were inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas and then sat on the bed and watched one of their movies. And then when it was over, they brushed their teeth and then they got in bed, turned out the light, and tried to go to sleep. But a few minutes after their lights were out, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, which was the 16th, Jens, Carol's husband and Julie's father, was anxiously waiting at the San Francisco airport for his wife and his daughter's friend. And he's looking at his watch and he knows they don't have that much time before their flight is going to take off. And he's just hoping they're going to come running around a corner and they're going to barely make this flight. But they don't. And finally, Jens, who does not have a cell phone, and neither does Carol, he decides there must have been some sort of miscommunication and that Carol and the girls must have flown on ahead. And so he decides at the last minute to just board the flight himself and fly to Arizona in hopes his family will be there. But when he touches down in Arizona, his family is not there. And so he rushed to the hotel hoping that maybe they were there. They weren't. He spoke to the hotel's front desk and said, hey, has my wife Carol contacted you? And they said, no, she hasn't contacted us and we have no record of her being here. And so Jens is obviously very upset. He's very worried, and he spends the rest of the day calling around to friends and family and acquaintances and anybody who might know where Carol and the girls are. But nobody has heard from them and nobody knows where they are. And so that night, as Jens is about to go to bed, he convinces himself that they are probably just fine. This is just some screw up. Carol is an unbelievably fierce woman. She's incredibly competent. She will take care of those girls, and I'm sure I will see them tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning and Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or reached out to him in any way, and there was just no sign of her or the girls, Jens finally contacted police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens, the first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge, which is the last place they knew Carol, Julie, and Sylvina had been. The manager of the lodge would tell police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But Carol had checked out in advance, so the manager would not have seen her anyways. She would not have had to go by the front desk on the way out. So that was not an anomaly. The manager also told police that on the 16th, after the three women should have been out of their room, the cleaners went by room 509, and when they went inside, it was vacant and nothing seemed amiss. It was relatively clean, minus some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk as they should be. It just looked like the women had left. And so the police reached out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport to see if Carol had made it to the airport and dropped off her car. But when they spoke to the manager of this rental company, they would say, no, Carol has not dropped off her car, and she hasn't called about extending her lease, which is now overdue. Based on the information the police gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, they began operating on the theory that the three women left their lodge motel room on the 16th and then either got into a car accident somewhere and had just not been found yet, or they had driven somewhere, gotten out of their car and gotten lost, perhaps inside of Yosemite National Park or some other trail somewhere, or they had fallen victim to some crime. But at this point, the police were not taking seriously the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as around the western entrance of Yosemite, but absolutely nothing was found. A number of workers from Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police and subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Also, a number of friends and family of the three women were also interviewed by police and cleared as well. Then, a few days after this search has started, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards inside of it, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California, which was a suburb that was located about 2 hours west of Cedar Lodge. Some high school students saw it on the ground and gave it to a police officer. There was no reason for Carol and the girls to be in Modesto, California, and so this signaled to police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And so if that was the case, then almost certainly these three women had fallen victim to some sort of crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued to search the roads and trails in and around Cedar Lodge and the western entrance to Yosemite, and they looked all over Modesto. But besides this wallet being found, there were no further developments with the case. Then on March 18th, which is about a month after the three women originally went missing, a hiker was way off in the middle of this forest about 2 hours north of Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto, California, when he turned onto this logging road that nobody really ever went down. And as he's walking down this road, he sees up ahead the skeleton of a car. It looks like a car had been set on fire. And so he calls it into police, not really knowing what he's looking at. The police come out and they're able to identify this car. This shell of a car is the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. When they searched the car, the inside, the main cabin of the car, there really was nothing left. There looked to be some remnants of some suitcases and maybe some clothing, but mostly it was just the frame of the car and some springs. But when they opened the trunk of the car, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies with their hands still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, they were able to confirm the bodies belonged to Carol and Sylvina. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie, the 15-year-old. She was not in the car, around the car, or in the surrounding areas. And so there was this glimmer of hope that maybe if law enforcement acts fast enough, they can find Julie and save her before it's too late. But all hope was lost when just a couple of days into this search around the car, when they still hadn't found anything, the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. And on this letter was this crude map that showed this very specific spot overlooking a lake. It was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the car was. And then on this note as well was a phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using this crude map, the police went to Don Pedro Lake. They went up to the overlook as marked on this map, and there they looked down and they saw the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie. At this point, police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California, that they believed were connected in some way to what happened to these three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest to the police. They were half-brothers Eugene Dykes and Michael Lorwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer and for several drug charges and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks, basically insinuating that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to these three women. And then after Carol, Sylvina, and Julie's bodies had been found, the synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol matched the synthetic fibers that were pulled off of Michael and Eugene on their clothing and from their vehicle when they were arrested. And so the police were very confident that they had their killers and they had them behind bars already. But they still needed to compile evidence before they could formally charge them and make their names public to the media. And so when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began panicking about a killer or killers on the loose, the police came out and said, "Everybody calm down. We have the people responsible. We just can't tell you who they are yet. You need to be patient. We're building the case, but everybody's safe. There's nothing to worry about." But 4 months went by and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders. But they continued to assure the public that they had their killers behind bars, and so nobody has anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the three bodies, Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 24-hour shift in the clinic, and he had just gotten back to his cabin, which was inside of Yosemite, when his pager went off. And so he went to a phone, he dialed the number that was on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up and said, "Hey, Dr. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person?" And Dr. Kidd said, "Sure, I'd love to help." And then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, "Hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one. And then before he could clarify, he hung up the phone. And so Dr. Kidd is really confused what he meant about these implications, because in the past 3 years he had worked at this park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people in the park, but they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always because the person got lost or fell or something, which was fairly common inside of the park. And so as soon as this convoy of other Yosemite staff members that are part of the search rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside, he hopped in one of the vehicles, and he asked the driver, what's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with regards to this missing person? And the driver would explain to him that, hey, 4 months earlier, we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina, and they were found murdered outside of Yosemite. And while the police have said they have their killers behind bars, the police still have not come out and actually named who their killers are or charged anyone in their murders. And so that's made many of us think that maybe they don't have the killer or killers behind bars. Maybe there's a killer or killers still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight we have another person who's gone missing inside of the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led many of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight. Dr. Kidd was totally shocked at this news, but he was even more shocked when he discovered who it was that was missing. It was somebody he knew. Her name was Joey Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide that knows everything about the park. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy of Yosemite staff that were going to be a part of the search sped around the corner and went down this unmarked road with huge trees on either side, and then eventually they came out of this heavily forested road and they entered into this unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end across this huge meadow is this one green cabin sitting at the base of this mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joey was living. As Dr. Kidd and the convoy went across this meadow and got closer to this cabin, Dr. Kidd could see park rangers walking around the perimeter of the cabin, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Dr. Kidd and his vehicle came to a stop right outside of the marked off area, they got out and they could see parked right next to the cabin was this white pickup truck. It was Joey's pickup truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage, and it looked like there was luggage that had spilled out onto the ground and some of the doors were still open. And so it gave Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers the impression that Joey must have either been loading things into her truck or unloading things out of her truck at the time she went missing. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers kind of huddled up with the park rangers, and the rangers explained that Joey's friends that were living in San Francisco were expecting Joey to arrive at their house the day before, but when she didn't and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called it in, and that's why they were there looking for her. And so after talking about the circumstances of the case, they all decided they would break into 5 different search groups, and they would begin searching the immediate area. Dr. Kidd and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin towards the tree line, and then once they got into that forest, they started walking towards this creek. And as they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and saplings, and it looked like someone had come running through there, and perhaps the person who was running was Joey. And so they begin following these tracks that go right alongside this creek, and then at some point, one of the searchers yells out, "Hey, what's that up there?" And about 10 feet ahead of them, where the ground kind of sloped down into a ditch out of view, right before the ditch, hanging on a little tree on the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. And so Dr. Kidd, who was at the front of his small search party, he began walking towards these keys, and as he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into this ditch right on the other side of these keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom, he immediately began to gag, and he turned around and quickly walked away. The other 4 searchers, they walked up and they had a look down, and they too had a similar reaction. And before long, the group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police, and the police sent a police officer to Joey Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and they need her to call them. And then he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joey's mother was immediately concerned and confused and tried to get more information from this officer, but the officer just said, look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything. And so eventually she thanked him, she shut the door, and she went into the kitchen and she dials this number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joey's mother, and at that point, the person who picked up quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior, and this person asked Joey's mother, are you aware that your daughter is missing? So Joey's mother says, no, I was not aware of that. And then this person very delicately says, ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin. Joey's mother's reaction was instant. She said, well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her because she's got bright red hair? Can you make sure it's really her? And the person on the other side of the line hesitated for a minute and then just said, ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you. And so after this call finally ended, Joey's mother was confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? That seems like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? And so she was horribly distraught. She didn't know what else to do. She was told to just kind of wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. And so she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to actually get out there and see what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. And so she has this very restless night's sleep where she's just praying that this person was not actually her daughter. And then the next morning she gets up, she rushes to the airport, and as she's waiting to board her plane, she grabs a newspaper from a nearby kiosk, and the headline reads, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite." And that's when she understood why that person could not tell her whether or not this was her daughter based on hair color. It's because this body did not have a head. But from the time she got that phone call to this headline running in the paper, these searchers had found the head. It was located 27 feet away under some brush, and they were able to confirm that it was the body of Joey Armstrong. Joey's death was immediately treated like a homicide, and right away, the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joey's murder is connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina from 4 months earlier, even though the police were still saying, we have our killers behind bars for those murders. Joey's murder is completely unconnected. Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right about this, because there was a break in Joey's case almost immediately. On the night that Joey went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin, and they noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout, and as it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in Yosemite Valley. And so within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite and was pulled off the side of this highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up. There was no one inside of this vehicle, but then down this embankment off the highway led down to this forest where there was a river kind of out of sight that people like to swim and fish in. And so these 2 officers decide to head down and see if maybe the driver is down there. So they make their way down, and sure enough, they come in contact with the driver. He was laying on this rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. And so the 2 officers, they come up to him and announce themselves, and this very well-built, good-looking guy stands up and he calmly covers himself, and he takes the marijuana out of his mouth, and he says, hey, what can I do for you guys? And so over the course of their conversation, the police would learn this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman at Cedar Lodge Motel. He would tell police that he was not anywhere near Joey's cabin on the night she went missing, and the police ultimately bought it and said, okay, they confiscated his marijuana, and then they walked back up the hill, leaving him down there, and they took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators that had been called in for this case, they analyzed those pictures those officers had taken of the tires of Kerry's car, and they compared them to pictures of the tire tracks at Joey's cabin, and they determined they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Kerry down again. This time he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots. It was a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering Joey Armstrong, and he was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was booked, Kerry dropped a bombshell. He confessed to not only murdering Joey Armstrong, But also he confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso, the friend of Julie Sund. And he did all of this on his own. He had no other accomplices, which means the police never had the killer or killers behind bars. It would turn out Eugene Dykes, who was one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about he and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold blanket, and so they did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many people who lived in that area and like some people in the media had speculated. Carey would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession of how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On February 14th, 1999, so the day that Carol, Julie, and Silvina arrived at Cedar Lodge, Carey was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Carey, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Carey walked up her front walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind that he was going to act on a fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. And so his plan that night was he would go inside and he would not only kill his girlfriend, but he would also kill her 2 daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out this plan, he noticed out one of their windows there was a man in their backyard. And he asked his girlfriend, "Who's that guy out there?" And she would say, "Oh, I hired someone to take care of our property. So he's going to be cutting the grass and, doing some things with our garden. He's going to be here for a little bit, but he'll stay outside." And so this totally screwed up Carey's plan because he was not expecting there to be anybody there that night. And so for several hours, Carey anxiously sat there constantly looking out the window, waiting for this guy to leave so he could kill these 3 people. But the worker was just taking a lot of time and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. And so finally, Carey left without any explanation. Angry and frustrated, he began driving back to Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. And when he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed there was a car he had not seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carey had this urge to find out who owned that car. And maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned that car, and she was potentially alone. And if that was the case, he could fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. And so Carey parked his car a little bit a ways from this red car, and he walked over to the room that was right in front of this red car. And it was room 509, and he peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up, and he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside of this room. It was Carol, Julie, and Silvina. And so Carey stayed back and continued looking through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside of this room. And after a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom and nobody coming into the room but these 3 women and no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. And so when Carey finally turned around and left to go back to his room, he made the decision that he was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, which was February 15th, Carey secretly followed the 3 women when they hopped in their rental and drove to Yosemite. He followed them to the parking lot, and then he waited in the parking lot until the women had finished going through the park and having this wonderful time. He trailed them from the parking lot back to the Cedar Lodge, and then he secretly followed them when they went to that diner and they had hamburgers for dinner. And he continued to follow them from a distance and watch them rent movies from the front desk. And he followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside their room and he watched them long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his room and he got his toolbox. In his toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. And then around 11 p.m., he left his apartment and went downstairs and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. And he looked in the window and it was totally dark inside, so he assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door and very cautiously opened it up just a crack, leaving that chain link lock still attached. And so she looked through at Carey and said, "Hi, can I help you?" And Carey, who held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that said he was the Cedar Lodge handyman, he said, "Hi, ma'am, sorry to disturb you so late, but there is a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. So can I come in and just have a quick look, and then I'll be out of here?" And Carol apparently was just not buying it, and she said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one, but even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow, because we're all trying to sleep?" sleep. But Carrie was very persistent, and Carrie was known to be very charming and very disarming, and eventually he talked his way into the room. And so he walks inside, he walks past the bed where the other two teen girls are still sleeping, he goes into the bathroom, and for a few minutes he kind of pretends to fiddle around inside of the bathroom while Carol is standing right outside looking in at him. And then at some point Carrie reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and he aimed it at Carol, and he said, "Stay calm, I'm not going to hurt you, this is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed their best chance at getting out of this situation was just to comply and do what he says. He'll rob us and then he'll leave and we'll be okay. And so Carol very dutifully went back into the room, and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend, and before long Carrie had tied up all three of them. He put the two teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he put Carol on the bed. And then he proceeded to assault Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. And then after she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. And then after he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room, he went to the bathroom, he opened it up, he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying, and pulled her out, and he left Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed, where he assaulted her before strangling her as well to death with some additional rope. And then after Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel and put her in the trunk of the rental car along with Carol's body. And then after that, he went back inside the motel room, and then once again he opened up the bathroom door, he grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But then afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. And while she was in there wondering what's going to happen to her, what happened to her mom, what happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room and tidy it up, and he moved all of their luggage out of their room and put it into the rental car. And then after he was satisfied, he went back inside the motel room, he opened up the bathroom door, he pulled Julie out and had her stand right outside the bathroom. And then Carrie proceeded to clean up the bathroom, but left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women had left in a bit of a hurry. And so after that, he grabbed Julie and he walked her out to the car and he sat her down in the front seat. She only had a blanket on at this point. Everything else had been taken off of her. And then Carrie hopped in the front seat and he began driving off. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She has no idea where her mom is. She has no idea where her friend is. She has no idea they're actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. And the man that had just assaulted her for hours is now driving her into the darkness. She has no idea where she's going, and all she's got is this blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal what's happening to this poor girl. And so for 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night, and the whole time he's trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she's going to be okay and that her mom and her friend, they're going to be okay. And then finally he pulls off the highway down some switchbacks into this big parking lot of the Don Pedro Lake. And then once he parks the car, there's no other cars around. It's still dark out. The sun hasn't come up. He gets out and he tells Julie to get out of the car. But Julie is so scared, she can't move. So she can't even get out of the car. And so Carrie gets out. He walks around to her side. He opens the door and he scoops her up like you might hold a baby. And he walked with her up the trail all the way to this overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. And once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and he laid it down, and then he proceeded to assault her again. And then as the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover his tracks. And so Carrie stops what he's doing. He stands up, he reaches down and pulls Julie up to her feet. And so she's standing with her back to the lake. And as he's looking at her, he says, "I love you." And then he pulls out his knife and begins hacking her throat. And then he pushes her down the hillside where she tumbles and finally comes to a stop underneath some bushes where she dies. Carrie grabbed the blanket on the ground and he walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was nobody out there, so he hopped inside. He drove out of the lot and drove 1 hour north until he was well into this forest, and he pulled down a logging road where he abandoned this car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, California, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of the road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's body were found in the back of the burned out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to police that had the map of where Julie's body was and that horrible message of "we had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to police in order to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there really was more than one person perpetrating these murders, hence the "we had fun with this one." Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carey along with the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. And that was because, one, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing violence against these three women. And two, probably most importantly, the police discovered when Carey was a child, his younger brother was kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. And although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carey. And so the police figured there's no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knows how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carey seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save these three women from being abducted or from being harmed. In July of that year, so 4 months after the three women's bodies were discovered, Carey, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, he was just driving around Yosemite kind of reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out this fantasy and not get punished for it, when he noticed there was this woman way off in the distance walking in and out of this cabin that was fairly isolated. And so he drove his 1979 International Scout blue SUV down this forested road, and he reaches this meadow, and he looks across this meadow, and now that this woman is even closer, he can tell she's clearly loading things into her truck, and she's going back and forth, and he's watching, wondering if there's anybody else helping her, because this cabin is very secluded, and he's thinking, if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. And so after a while, when he only sees her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decides he's gonna go kill her. And so he drives across the meadow and he pulls up right next to her truck and he gets out and he introduces himself. And the woman is so completely caught off guard by this random strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly, that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she says, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" And Carey would proceed to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. And then at some point, Carey drew a pistol and he aimed it at her and said, "Go inside your cabin." And so Joey put her hands up and she went inside the cabin like she was told, and Carey followed her inside, and then he bound her wrists and he bound her mouth with duct tape, and then he ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. And then once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carey got in the driver's seat and he began leaving the cabin, headed back out away towards that road he came in on. And as he's bombing across the meadow, Joey leaps head first out of the window of this moving car and smashes onto the ground, and she immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carey jams on the brakes, he hops out and he starts chasing after Joey, but Joey manages to get fairly close to that tree line right behind the cabin before Carey ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. And then Joey is viciously trying to fight Carey off of her, and Carey, kind of in a panic, draws his knife and he tries to slash at Joey, but Joey tucks her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. And so frustrated, Carey just stands up and he grabs Joey by the hair and he begins hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. And the whole time Joey's doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just can't. And finally they get inside the woods and Carey drags her into this ditch, and once she's down at the bottom, he puts his foot on the top of her head and forces it back, forcibly exposing her throat. And then at that point he pulls out his knife and he begins to cut. Afterwards, Carey considered keeping Joey's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carey attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as is, he left her cabin as is. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to Cedar Lodge. Carey would tell police that as soon as he killed Joey Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her 2 young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out the attack. Carey Stainer, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera that was found intact near the burned out car in the woods. The police would develop the pictures on this camera in hopes there would be some clue as to who murdered them, but it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Carrie confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images of the camera roll, we know Carrie Stainer was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on this camera was taken by Julie of her mother sitting on the bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they're getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Carrie knocked on their door.